Welcome to another episode. Today, I'm joined by Nam, who's the co-founder of Hyperlane, another great interop project in the space. And today, we're here to kind of debrief uh, our takeaways from Devcon. So last week, all of us spent 5 or 6 days in Thailand. The vibes were great. Every team was there, so I actually got to see a lot of people for the first time. And Nam had the great idea of just summarizing some of our takeaways. So, Nam, thank you for doing this and welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Super excited, super honored. I think to be on, and like excited also for this kind of like debrief, I guess, session of the podcast, which I feel like honestly is always my favorite. To kind of like just hear of like, hey, like what were the people like, like what was like for everybody to take crypto Twitter and just move it in person.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the vibes were great. This was the first time that I was at a bigger conference, and Bitcoin was hitting all-time highs. Everyone was just happy to see everyone. So it felt really nice for me. Like I don't do too many conferences, but this kind of changed my opinion slightly. So you might see me more often, maybe. But yeah, so how are we going to do this? We've both of us have come up with a list of a few takeaways. We're just going to go through them pretty quickly, have a conversation, and hopefully some of you guys who were not there can feel a little bit of like our enthusiasm towards interop, right? So the first one that I want to talk about is what everyone is basically talking about these days. It's meme coins, right? So I feel any team that I was talking to, it was either like DJs in the team trading meme coins, or any chain that I would talk to would try to kind of build products around meme coins, right? Because maybe a year ago, meme coins were not the hot thing, but now everyone has realized speculation is what drives volumes in crypto, and every chain, every product wants volumes and kind of replicate what Solana is building today. So interestingly, like every time I would have a conversation with someone, they would show me internal products that they're building for like easier meme coin trading, and they're all great products, right? But they're all kind of like pump fun, and it's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting to see how the opinion of so many people has changed around meme coins. Do you have an opinion on meme coins? Are you trading meme coins?
I'm known as I think a luddite when it comes, I guess, to both meme coins and NFTs. Like I own zero NFTs, I own zero meme coins, which maybe makes me a bit odd in our space. But I think what we or I or we working on Hyperlane find are interesting about meme coins is I think they are like a very great expression of what I would call like the greatest thing about industry, which is permissionlessness, right? Like I think there's a lot of things which people might have judgments on of like, oh, is this worth it our time? Is this worth our industry? But I think what's absolutely the coolest about the industry is that like it doesn't matter, right? Like you cannot stop somebody from like creating these meme coins. You cannot stop somebody from trading these meme coins. And that was kind of something that we've basically very much built into the fabric of Hyperlane because we're all about like permissionless interoperability, right? Like you should not have to kind of like get the permission of an internet provider to like kind of like make your meme coin go cross chain. Like you should be able to just do it and kind of like not have to rely on that. And I think, yes, like today that is meme coins, right? But I think what is also equally exciting is to kind of see people taking that approach of like, hey, yes, oh, cool, I can do meme coins. I can also do these applications. And oh, nobody can stop me. Like, I think that's absolutely cool. And so, yeah, like, I think sometimes there's a bit like unwarranted hate on like, I think the meme coins. And even speaking as somebody who does zero meme coin trading, I think that's like super cool. And like, agreed, like a lot of, I think, excitement about that kind of product experience, I guess.
It's super organic, which is the nice part. Like you said, it's permissionless, right? Like nobody has control over anything, so anyone can go on pump fun, create a new meme coin. If it gets bonded, everyone starts trading. And interestingly, like there are also a lot of cross chain products being built around meme coins because again, like speculation, volume, and the fact that you can do it across chains is always going to be a benefit. But I don't know if it sees traction. Like personally, I'm of the opinion that meme coins see traction because of Solana's community and because of like Base's community. It's the user base. It's not really the product at the end of the day. So anyone who's able to bootstrap the user base kind of gets all the volume and the hype and the attention.
Yep. Yes, I think it's a good point. Like, it's not clear to me. I sometimes people ask me like, oh, like, right, like, does Hyperlane do NFT bridging? And right, like maybe similarly, like, it's not clear to me that I personally know, right, like what does the benefit of cross chain add to the NFT or to the meme coin? But yeah, again, I guess to be the repetitive guy, like, I think I shouldn't be the one deciding whether that's useful or not. Like, the people should decide.
Awesome. So, like moving on from NFTs, we can move on to apps and chains. There were a lot of chain abstraction panels. There was also a summit around abstraction, and in general, it feels like there's a new big chain launch worth talking about every week, right? And there's also like this movement for like application specific chains. It's been around for a long time, but now it just feels like it's accelerating because some of the industry leaders in Uniswap has launched their own chain, and if you look at any roadmap of the blue chip DeFi projects, it seems like there's a chain somewhere in the roadmap, right? So now it just feels like apps are trying to find ways to accrue value. It can be either through launching their own chain, or there are interesting concepts like application specific sequencing that are also coming up. But it just feels like there are going to be so many more chains, and every app will kind of want to have their own chain. Every app that's more ambitious will try to create that chain as a generalized chain, like a uni chain, and then try to create an ecosystem around it. And I want to know your take on this as an interop provider, right? Like, how do we scale and connect all of these chains?
Yes. Yeah, I think great question. I feel like people will say that it's like I wasn't made a layup, but it is something that we've like Hyperlane. We started Hyperlane about 3 years ago. Back then, it was called Abacus. And one of the things that I think we decided on, like we realized, I think very early on, is that this kind of like explosion of change will happen, right? And it's like in hindsight, kind of obvious in the sense that right, like the Ethereum ecosystem was all about like roll-up centric scaling roadmap. But I don't think people realized it honestly up until this year what it really meant, right? Like for people to I think kind of like launch these chains, and in that world, right? Like you have to like approach interoperability very differently than what you did before, right? Like I think most I would say of interoperability protocols, right? Again, are what I would say like they might like some people might call them permissionless, but to some degree or another, you do have to basically talk with the team that is building that inner protocol to get your chain connected, And if you, I think Uniswap, Unichain, right? You do not need to talk to these teams, right? Like everybody wants to be on Unichain, and so you definitively never have that problem, right? But like you said, like there's like a new chain launching, and those are just the big chains, right? Like I think like ENS, I think announced that they're going to launch a chain, right? Like Kraken with Ink. Those are like I think three that just I think announced in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and there's definitely more coming. But if you're not one of those like big three chains, right? Like or three projects that are launching their own chain, like then you basically get into this what I would call like the battle of like finding the BD team, right? Like I think again, we in New York, like a lot of right, like us have a network to find the BD team of these interrupt protocols. But a lot of us, especially right, like out here in Asia, like you might have much larger trouble A, finding those people, and B, convincing them that like the rollup that you're launching, which right, like everybody already says these days, like, oh my god, like why are you launching another L2? Like, right, like you have to now convince them that like you are worth their time to basically deploy their infrastructure to your chain. And so to answer your question, like I think we kind of thought about, okay, hey, like this doesn't seem scalable, right? Like this doesn't seem like actually doable to connect all of these rollups. And so one had to design something like Hyperlane in a very different way to allow chains that launch to connect themselves to other chains in a permissionless way. And so we drew a lot of inspiration from obviously like IBC, which is kind of like I think the major, like or the first and major kind of like permissionless interoperability protocol out there. But yeah, very proud that like over the course of like I would say the last 2 years, what we've worked on is to kind of like make it a reality that like teams who can launch their own chain, whether that's actually just a vanilla, like let's say like EVM L2 rollup, or like something completely else, to basically connect themselves to this kind of broader set of block space that is being created without needing any permission. And there's some again more and more kind of examples of people who basically deploy and operate Hyperlane without us ever being kind of like in that path.
I mean, yeah, like how much ever we may want to like ignore this BD aspect to everything, it's true, right? Like as an aggregator, we do share some of the same pains because every time there's a new chain launch, we don't have a bridge, so you have to go talk to the bridges to support them. So it's always easier if they can do things permissionlessly, or even if the incentives align, like we can do it permissionlessly, right? So it's a great feature to have. Rather than like, I would rather have it than like not have an option at all. So yeah, we're definitely on the same page here. The other thing related to interop protocols that I got from like the conversations was basically that okay, until now we've done messaging, right? Like send a message from one chain to another, send data in that message, send assets in that message. But there's a very big camp, at least in the Ethereum ecosystem, that does not like this model of like having to send a message from one chain to another. And now, at least in the last 6 months, it feels like interop protocols are also starting to provide on-chain data access as like a product. So Wormhole has cross-chain queries. Layer Zero announced LZ Read during the Devcon week, and like I talked to a bunch of interop teams that were just launching, and it felt like even though they have been building messaging products for the last few years, they're seeing more demand for, let's say, like data in the form of proofs or like verifications. They don't want to do cross-chain messaging anymore. Or like they at least want the option, like the customers want the option. So I'm curious if you had any similar insights, similar conversations from your time.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes I was talking with Zaki from Sommelier last week as well, and I think he tweeted something along the lines of like, how do we prevent like Ethereum from like not learning the lessons from Cosmos? And like I think a lot of these, let's say like I think like IBC has something they call I think interchain queries, right? And so I feel like now we're like I guess on this part of the like IBC path where we realize queries are interesting. Like to be honest, I think we as Hyperlane we've been focusing a lot we continue to focus on messaging, and like we actually have had what we call our interchain queries version as well for quite a while. I think we've just removed it from our docs because we weren't actually sure like we haven't yet seen like super great I think applications or use cases of that API, but it's certainly something that people ask us for all the time. And so we're obviously always very happy to kind of chat with folks about kind of like their use cases and whether like messaging may or may not kind of like apply there. And just I guess I want to be very clear, definitely use cases where I think the notion of like being able to read state from a Roma chain without having to trigger basically a state transition on origin chain, that's definitely, I think, valuable. And there's going to be applications of that. But we do feel that like there's a lot of like I think there's a lot of surface area with respect to messaging that is not currently being covered. And like sometimes people just like take the kind of easy shortcut of like, oh, I just want this without kind of like fully thinking through the solution space. That being said, like I totally agree. Like I think one observation from Devcon definitely is that this kind of like notion of like just reading state. And I haven't personally looked at LZ read yet, but I think that's definitely something that I've observed as a kind of thing from Devcon as well.
It's just a easier mental model for people to kind of get behind, I feel. So I was having just another conversation, and I think Bo from Polymer also mentioned this. So he mentioned how when Chainlink launched, like 4 or 5 years or whatever, whenever they launched, they had all the tooling, they had all the infra, but they basically had no application developers building apps on top of smart contracts in general, right? So they were like, okay, we have this infra. Now we have to spend resources on educating developers how to build applications on top that can potentially use Chainlink's infrastructure, right? So I feel now interop protocols are in the same position where we've spent 3 years building like the basic foundation, but now it's about optimizations, adding more features, and maybe like building this toolkit, developer resources that actually talk about how can you build omni-chain applications, how can you build cross-chain applications. And this data trend, I feel, is another thing that would make developers in general just build on top of interop protocols more. So I feel like it's a good trend.
Yes, yeah, it's funny. Like actually, when we first started what we called Abacus Works, we originally started that side, right? And we were like, oh, like people need to build these we called them like natively interchain application, right? Like oh, not just a token bridge. And yeah, it turns out it's very hard. It turns out it's very hard. And like we had some APIs, but then like people kept asking us for like, oh, like I want to be right, like I want to have a token bridge to this chain. I want to have a token bridge to that chain. And so that's kind of like when like Hyperlane kind of like ended up focusing more on that angle. But it's true that I think for not just I think interoperability, but to be honest, for our like industry as a whole, for it really to make sense, like at some point we do need to see those applications. And so I do think it's like super cool that like like other interoperability projects are basically starting to kind of improve the efforts on providing more useful developer infrastructure to allow developers to hopefully take those and turn them into more useful applications. I think actually in some ways, I think a lot of the like chain abstraction and even things like like DeFi and Jumper like are kind of like examples of like like maybe the other side of the spectrum of like hey allowing applications to have a more useful like cross-chain experience without needing to actually like drop into the smart contract level and like kind of like doing let's say like facilitation of like synchronized state or something themselves. And so I do feel like both of those are like a little bit like two sides of the same coin. And so ultimately it has to get to the point where like, yeah, like I think the user experience of like a user using crypto has to be abstracted away, right? Like, yeah.
I think so. That's a good segue into the chain abstraction takeaway for me. So I feel like overall, chain abstraction is a good movement, is a good narrative because I feel like this whole these conversations are going to push some of the feature development timelines to like the next 6 months, whereas on the other hand we would have been much slower rolling out these features. So I feel like overall net positive for the industry because we're going to accelerate improving the UX in terms of like making everything easier, making everything faster, quicker, one click experience. But like in general, my takeaway was also that like this is post Devcon as well, but like during Devcon, I think it was just reinstated that so many of the chain abstraction teams today are just like interrupt teams from the last 2 or 3 years. I don't know what to make of that, but there are a few legit teams in the ecosystem that are working, and I feel a lot of these conversations, discourse would just like push us forward, accelerate a lot of the UX improvements that would otherwise take 2 years, maybe.
Yes, I think I thought like I agree that I think chain abstraction was definitely like a very big topic this week or like last week, right? And I think it comes from a little bit this feeling of like right like the gut reaction of like, oh my god, there's too many L2s. Like I cannot, right? Like my MetaMask chain list is just too damn long, and I don't want to deal with that. And I think what's very honestly cool to see is just how much progress the chain abstraction folks have made. Like I think we're definitely still like further away, and like right like I think we need most major wallets to effectively give that kind of chain abstract experience and not just have them be like right like net new wallets, let's say, that do those. But I've definitely seen some examples of folks being able to kind of like build those product experiences, which were like super cool to see. Like I think one of the examples I want to plug in here is like the eco team has kind of like realized that like, hey, yes, we care about chain abstraction. We want to kind of provide ultimately the best user experience for our users to right like send stables around or do stuff with stables and dollars. And as part of that, I think what's going to be really cool to see is this kind of like collaboration between these kind of like chain abstracted, like maybe more like wallet kinds of folks with the interoperability folks, right? Because to ultimately facilitate this experience, you need interoperability both in the messaging as well as in the liquidity bridging. And so yeah, Eco was basically like I think first started down the like kind of storage proof mechanism, which I think effectively meant that they were building right like their own kind of interoperability messaging protocol, and they I think will still do more research on that. But like using something like Hyperlane allowed them to I think just move much quicker. And so I'm hoping that I think people actually like recognizing that like hey, modularity and layers and abstraction are very useful to basically get good user experiences to users faster than like let's say us waiting 4 years to kind of get that experience.
Yeah, I think one of my tweets after the first day was basically there's no chain abstraction without interop protocols. And that's because like this is the foundation everything is kind of built on top of, right? So I'm definitely bullish on interop teams playing a big part in this. Just staying on chain abstraction for a bit, I feel like intents are also kind of part of the same boat. So I talked to a lot of teams that were building stuff around intents, solvers, AI agents, maybe. So I felt like, I mean, the ideas are interesting, but it felt like a lot of the ideas were just automation. Like that was my takeaway. So I don't know how to differentiate between a solver and automation at this point. Like everything sounds the same because the use case is
Yeah.
the same. And it just feels like there's a lot of narrative and positioning play also going on. So it's very hard to figure out how do you define a solver? How do you define an AI agent? And what is just like automation and what are intents at the end of the
Yes.
day?
Yeah. It was I think it's a good point. And I think I guess both I think two things are true, right? Like one is that like I think intents are like a very interesting model, right? Like a kind of the like declarative over like imperative model, which like sounds just kind of like generally more easier to reason about. Um and like we think right like you can imagine that there's like a lot of like useful UX improvements to be had from allowing users to basically not specify the routing but just like say the outcome that they want. And also there's like some effects of like allowing like specific parties, I'm not going to call them solvers, specific parties to take on finality risk to kind of like improve the user experience. I think it's also like I got the sense that there's a lot of like resource lock excitement that like I think right like originally maybe got started from Unbalance, but there's now a lot of other teams very prominent teams that are also kind of looking into resource locks for, I think, very similar reasons of like allowing to speed up the user experience, which I think ultimately obviously is beneficial to the user. But I think the kind of like the other side of the statement is also true, which is that intents oftentimes become like a crutch when basically people like, oh, just like don't want to solve something, like don't want to solve this hard problem. And so they just think like, oh, somebody else will solve this. And I think there's this kind of perpetual search for like, who's going to run all these solvers? Like, who are they? Like, they're like a mythical creature sometimes that like, yeah, like I think there's definitely probably too many people who are naive about like how hard it is to actually find those solvers and actually make them do the work. And it's, I sometimes compare it to like, you know, like declarative programming is also sounds very nice, but like actually doing this in practice turns out to be much harder. Like most programmers still program in a fairly imperative way. And so I think conceptually, great. And I think actually getting this live in practice for like user experiences is something that's very hard. And I think we should definitely applaud the kind of intent protocol that actually live in creating the user experience, because it's definitely not trivial. And it's probably something about as well.
Yeah, I feel like intents kind of divides opinion in a lot of ways, because a lot of people agree that they're cool, but a lot of people also think that it's a short-term fix to the UX problems, which might not be wrong. Like I feel Arjun Bhuptani on one of his panels basically said intents are the L2s of interop. They make things faster and solve a lot of our UX problems of today. But
Yep.
a sense that I got from a lot of my conversations with others was basically like, this is going to be a solution for 2 or 3 years, but at the end of the day we need more collaboration on like a chain level, ecosystem level, to build long term sustainable solutions. I don't personally agree with that. I feel like intents have kind of breached the threshold that they will stick around long enough, but again, this is just like speculation. Nobody knows what's going to happen in 3 years, but I'm curious if
Yes.
you have an opinion on this.
Yeah, so I think it's. I actually didn't know that Arjun said this about intents, but like I was, because I was before you even said that, I was going to ask you this way as well. Where I feel like people probably said the same thing about sequencers, right? Where people said like, "Oh my god, like sequencers are going to be so centralized, and like the government will just like take one of the sequencers out," and then we all realized that we have like taken on like a crazy liveness assumption on the sequencers. And what I mean, we're like definitely 2 3 years in, it definitely feels still very far away from like, oh well, hopefully I'm going to knock on some wood here somewhere, but hopefully no government's going to take out a sequencer. And so I similarly feel that like, I think intellectually speaking, I think it's true that like I think the liveness assumptions that we make on solvers might not be ideal in systems that we create. But I also feel like we can definitely buy ourselves plenty of time to kind of like solve those questions the same way that we still haven't really solved like the decentralized sequencer problem, right? And so in that sense, I think like my biggest problems with intents is definitely not that like, yeah, we haven't figured out that problem. Honestly, my personally biggest problem with intents is that not enough people get it, right? Like I think the intents experience today is honestly like, this is again going to be my shtick, but like it's very permission, right? Like there's really like only a handful of chains, there's a handful of assets which are really being served by intents. And so I think the way bigger problem with intents is that it needs to be way more accessible, so that if you launch a new rollup or if you have a particular asset that you want to swap, like you are not kind of like beholden to like I think a fairly like limited set of protocols that can basically provide that experience to you. Because that's honestly one of the things that I notice in my conversations with chains and applications is that like they would like to have the intent experience, right? And then like what I do is like I have to like tell them, oh, like I like this experience, right? Like I like Heart a lot. Like Across is really awesome, but like you know, Across is only on so many chains, and like I've been trying to convince Heart to come to many more chains, but like I think there's a lot of like limitations with respect to I think scalability of the intent experience that I don't think are actually inherent. I think these are just like typical engineering problems, and so that's one of the things that I'm definitely very excited to like work on to basically give intents, I think, the kind of like I guess the coverage that it deserves.
Okay, so you brought up Heart, and we're talking about intents. So I feel like we have to talk about ERC 7683.
Of
Heart
course.
was basically everywhere. He was seen everywhere at every event of the conference, just red pilling people about 7683. Uh, and his pitch is super strong, right? It's unifying Ethereum. Everybody can rally behind that. So I think he did a great job. I actually saw his presentation. It was a very, very solid presentation. But
Yes.
there are also criticisms. Like it was pretty funny, right? Like I was there at the event, and Hart was giving a keynote on 7683, but then there were a few panels right before this keynote, and everyone was kind of talking about 7683 and kind of criticizing it. So Hart came in after that, and he did not know the criticisms, but he knew that like people have been talking about it, so it was pretty funny. But okay, so talking about the criticisms, like people are saying that it's maybe not the most expressive standard. Maybe it's not the most like feature rich standard, and Ethereum should be like unopinionated. We should not promote like one standard and let the market kind of decide which standard is better, and we will see it through adoption, right? Like let the market forces play out. Let the incentives be open. Whoever wins the market wins the standard wars. Yeah, like what's your read on this situation related to intents and
Yeah.
standards?
Yeah, so I think, interop and standards, like, I think probably in some dictionary it's actually the same thing, right? But I think the idea is that like you will get better interoperability if people together use the same standard, right? Like you basically avoid incompatibilities, you avoid like adapters, you avoid like people not being able to communicate with each other just because they like basically doing the same thing, they just don't happen to speak the same language, right? And so it's a little bit like saying like, oh, like we'll let the free market decide kind of what language we use to talk to each other. And so I don't think that that's a great answer either. But then also like, right, like how do you decide what is the common language? And that becomes, I think, a very political decision. And so like, right, like let's say English, right? Like English is like the common language that we all use. Like, do I think English is the best language? Probably not, right? And so maybe in that sense, like, yeah, sure. I'm sure there's like criticisms that you can have of like 7683. Like I think it's right, like it's fairly general. And so I think one of the common criticisms is that like, yeah, hey, if I'm a solver and I want to basically solve for two different 7683 protocols, right, like implementations, it's actually very hard for me to reason about them. And so, right, like, do I actually get benefits from standardization? And like, I don't know that we need to like discuss kind of like the intricacies of like that question, like right here. I'm happy to like, come like DM me on, tag me on Twitter, and then we can get into that. And like, I'm sure there's plenty of other people who have the same opinion. But I think like what Hart and Uniswap folks across and Uniswap folks have done, I think tremendously well, is do that political support, right? Like honestly, I don't remember a single ERC which has gotten this broad of a political support base, so to speak, for something I think that is so critical for right something like Ethereum, right? Like in such a quick manner. And I think that is something that I think people severely underestimate, and it is something that I think, I think is like, okay, I think Hart sometimes doesn't get enough credit for that, as I think kind of the right like the public figure of 7683, and I think that was reflected, I think, in I guess his popularity last week. And so ultimately, I think 763 is a good enough first step in the right direction. And then there's further standardization that one can do on 7683 when it comes to like, I think maybe tightening some of the interfaces to allow people to more easily reason about the security guarantees of, let's say, like the settlement contracts. And it is something that honestly, like I think we're super excited about. Like one of the things that we're working on that we'll hopefully share more about over the next coming weeks is that like we actually built a like reference implementation of 7683 and what we call this kind of like intent framework that is being worked on by Bootnode. And so actually having kind of a substrate for which we can express these things in an open source manner, where we can like basically like have reference implementations of maybe, like a tighter 7683, or maybe we can have like another implementation with different trade-offs. Like I think that makes it much easier to reason about than to kind of like, I think, talk about a standard up in the abstract, which I think sometimes happens a little too much in our industry.
Yeah, I feel the political battle, even though it feels like just another thing on the checklist, is probably one of the biggest things you can do for any standard. Just having buy-in for like this one thing, it's a great starting point because, like you said, now you guys can build on top of it. Other teams can like see it, have a reference implementation, add features to it, add like ways that you can fit into it. We can do it, other teams can do it, and suddenly like one thing leads to another, and we have a good enough standard, right? Like we have to start somewhere. That's what I feel like.
Yes.
For the last 3 years, I've just been hearing about different standards, different numbers, different like names. But for the first time, I feel like there's a standard that has a decent amount of buy-in. Not actually just a decent amount; it has a good amount of buy-in. And
Yeah.
for anyone trying to build anything around intents, there's a starting point. There's something to look at, a framework to look at that you can, like standardize your code base with, and then other teams can build against the same thing, and you guys can cooperate on something. So I feel like that goes a long way.
Yes, it was interesting. There was a interop forum on Saturday, I think, which was the last day, and I think we missed, unfortunately, some folks because I think some folks already booked a ticket previously, and I think this event got scheduled relatively late. But I think in some ways, we've actually been able to achieve standardization of things like intents, maybe much further than we did, let's say, for the actual message passing level, below that, right? I think below that, there's a lot of folks like Hyperlane and others who kind of trying to do the same thing. And I think it was very much recognized at that interop forum that something like the fact that there's no standardized interface means there's a lot of kind of fragmentation and just wasted work all across the stack, which is just not helpful, I think, for Ethereum as a whole right now. And so I'd be very interested to see if the kind of not just Ethereum, but honestly I think the broader crypto ecosystem is able to rally around I think standardization of message APIs, because that I think would just help so much, because honestly so many standards on top would have a much easier time if there was such a thing as a standardized message API. And it's something that I think we as Hyperlane are obviously very interested in, because that's kind of how we've I think designed and architected our API very well, and so I think it lends itself for standardization quite well. But hopefully there's more I can share there of other teams who actually have recognized the kind of the power of I think a very general message API that can encompass many different security models to kind of allow for that standardization to happen. And I guess Velodrome, I think with what we call kind of Superlane, I think is a great example of just the first of hopefully many examples to do that.
So I want to kind of talk a little bit more about this point. So you're referring to the event on Saturday where a bunch of L2 teams came together trying to fix interop, and this comes from the fact that they're all building clusters of chains, chain of chain model, and they need to figure out a way to have intercluster interop, or even within their cluster just have better connectivity. And I feel a lot of them are building in-house solutions at this moment, right? And they will run into a lot of problems that a lot of the interop teams have run into over the last 3 years. So my only criticism, or my only takeaway, is that why are we building things from scratch again? Basically, why can't we just collaborate on things where the L2 teams are working closely with the interop teams, or just pick one. I don't care if you pick Hyperlane, if you pick a layer 0 wormhole. Why can't you be more opinionated about these things? You can just pick one for your entire cluster and it's okay, right?
Yes. So I will try to learn my lesson from heart and try to know how to kind of play the game well. But I think maybe to be neutral, I think, to both sides. I think it is hard, right? Because I think today choosing interop, right, at the messaging level feels very much like you picking a vendor, right? It very much feels like, oh, I have to put my it feels a bit like choosing cloud providers, right? By choosing this provider, you basically tie yourself to the fate of that provider, and then if they go bankrupt, well, you fucked, right? And so in the early days, it was kind of I don't want to choose a cloud provider, right? I'm running my own server in a rack somewhere, because I can always buy a server somewhere else. And I think I totally agree with you that we as a broader industry need to get away from that. And I think one of the kind of questions I'm honestly trying to pose most of these kind of L2 teams, or just honestly any team that's kind of thinking about building interop, is to basically think about hey, what does it mean to choose a vendor in interop, versus what does it mean to choose a open stack in interop, right? Basically, when do you feel you're actually not choosing Google Cloud, but you're choosing Kubernetes, right? And that kind of that allows you to be actually vendor neutral. And so I think, a lot of these efforts, I think that you've provided these kind of cluster efforts, maybe actually have been started quite a while ago, where maybe it wasn't as obvious, if there are such things as kind of neutral interoperability, frameworks. And certainly I believe that today, I think, right, your reaction, I think, probably indicates that maybe we have gotten to the point where that is more the case. And I'm honestly right, we at Hyperlane, we've really only started doing this 3 years ago, just many other teams, right, Greg from ChainSafe, the Everclear folks, right, who've honestly been doing this even longer than I have. But I do think we are in a very interesting point now of this intersection of I think people realizing that hey, we just cannot keep doing this, but also, hey, there are actual real neutral basically frameworks on which we can build this kind of standardized API. And so I feel actually very hopeful that again, more and more folks are realizing that, more and more folks are choosing to build on these interoperability frameworks versus vendors. And so I think it's just a matter of time, and we're kind of seeing like basically a lagging indicator of the fact that like some people just thought about their clusters like earlier than that.
Yeah. So I'm like very happy that these conversations are happening now. That like there's no part of me that's disliking these conversations. I'd much rather have the conversation and be like, okay, how do we solve this? We need to like solve this now. The only thing is like, let's not waste another 3 years. Uh, let's try to build a solution that we can have in the next 6 to 12 months. Maybe that's too much to ask for, but like we'll see how it plays out.
Yes.
Right.
I mean, my view, to be honest, is like, right, like some folks, right, and again, like I think probably OP and the super chain are probably like the ones who are furthest along, right? Like they already have the head start, and so I think obviously they maybe like will find less of a reason, even though I think there's still plenty of reasons of like, hey, right, like if you want to send a message over both like super chain, like interop, and like other chains, like say Arbitrum, right? Like what you do as a developer, right? Like that's obviously not answered, but again, some people have like kind of like a head start there. But I think anybody else who's now kind of like late to the game has to recognize that, like, look, we cannot do what they have already done because we're a year behind. And I think you will find that there's going to be more desire to like basically not reinvent the wheel there. And so I'm hopeful for that.
Mhm. Awesome. So I think that covers all of my takeaways or like our takeaways. Just the last takeaway in general was it was just so nice to see everyone. People are so much nicer in person. I mean, they're nice on Twitter as well, but it's just a PFP behind our laptops, just like typing away. In person, everyone is just it's good vibes. Like nobody is fighting.
Yes.
Everyone's nice to
Agreed.
each other, so that was nice.
Yes. No, that was like definitely, and I think this is maybe the way to solve all problems in crypto is that we just like actually force ourselves to go to these every month. Although that's probably not great for the climate. But yeah, like I think just like in person, everything's so much more productive. Like there's a lot of collaboration happening between what you might call competitors, because I think we all recognize that ultimately we need our space to advance. And yeah, like I've had so many, I think, great conversations with folks as well. Not just about, hey, like what we can do together, but also just like, hey, we're people, right? Like we are ultimately like these nerds who like decided to like that this industry is kind of like the place where they want to spend all of their time and love to argue about things. And so I think it's great to know that like, oh, you're like me. I like you.
Yeah, maybe the end game is actually a crypto network state, and all of us can just like live near each other, just talk to each other all the time. But I don't know if that's happening anytime soon. So thanks a lot for taking the time. I know it's pretty late for you in the night, but yeah, it was just like super fun hanging out, super fun to be at DevCon, super fun to have all of these conversations in person. And personally, like I came out of all of it much more bullish on Interop because like something clicked in my head where it was like we can't build anything in crypto without interop protocol. So you hate us or you like us, you have to work with us.
Yeah, I will say it was funny. Like I think Greg and Lane tweeted a little bit about it, where it was like, hey, like ETH interop forum, but none of the interop people on there. At the same time, like you said, like I think you couldn't talk to anybody last week and not realize that like interop I think is an important problem to solve. And so I think for you and I as people who I think spend a lot of time thinking about interop, that's a very nice feeling. Like I think like we tell you. I've been doing the conference circuit for quite a while, and 2 weeks ago that was very much not the case. Like I think it was very much involved convincing people that interop is like an important problem to solve. And so I think definitely we'll have a good experience coming to conferences. And so I guess maybe I can ask you like, oh, which one will people get to catch you next?
I don't know. You have to tell me. You're the expert. Like I'm very new to this. So what's the next big conference that I should attend?
What the next one you should attend? So I guess the next big one that will probably happen is ETH Denver, but that feels like a very, very far flight for you. So I'm not sure.
Maybe I've never been to the States, so maybe this is what motivates me to actually get my visa, book the flights, and come.
That is a good point. Yes, yeah, I think that's probably the next big one. And out. Like I personally love America. Like I'm gonna become a citizen in like 3 weeks, which I'm very excited about. And once you're out there, you can do a good old American road trip. So I think that honestly that's probably a good one out there. And then I think there's probably going to be a few, I think, in Europe over the summer. And Europe feels like kind of like a good place for people to centralize and meet as well. So yeah, like hopefully see you at one of those.
Awesome. It was great catching up with you last week. Thank you for doing this. And hopefully this is helpful for people who are not there.